So I came back. How we attended the class previously. I hope it comes to your pleasure. And so in this class, our points of deliberation will go to the complement nature of both traditions and some insightful introduction about a major legal systems in the world. For example, less of positivism and the concept of supereminent principles not provided for by legislation will be briefed. So how do you agree if the final points of reliance could be found in the ideas of law? There's convergence and divergence would be a topic for our next class, but you are now initially introduced to meditate about ideas of law. One of eminent French comparators, Leonard David, points to some context of a supereminent principles which can be compatible, where compatible or within the natural. So you may learn in the class that the vacuum of law could not exempt the jurist from non-adjudication. They have to deliver the opinion of court to resolve the case at bar. Then what about the lack of provisions to be applied, or a fundamental gap between the clauses, or how do you interact with a principal provision as in Article 2 of a Korean Civil Code, for example, protection of abuse of right, a protection against abuse of right, or the fundamental guideline in binding nature over in terms of a fair dealings and a faith between the parties engaged in civil relationships overall. For the professor's version, the general principle is just a product of less positivism, and in manifests the list of process in many practical context, points of context, and also in some hierarchical interaction between two branches. The Leonard David words would rather employ a supereminent principles when the legislature goes absolutely in silence about the matters. Then the final place we have to rest would be an idea of law, which is compatible to natural. And also, you are well exposed to the tactics, skills, and points of a focus in terms of civil law tradition, what I call interpretation. So the interpretive work is generally considered a major points of efforts that the civil law jurists have to make to deliberate the cases or controversies. There are several principles to lead you to a precise about your list of work, and there are, I suppose it will be for the next class, for the time limits of this class. Then, as I mentioned, we have some access from Professor Harrow, And I suppose it is not dear to all scope of reviews, and so I will be delivered in accepted way to make a point uh, which considered to be essentially pertinent to our previous discourse. For example, he says the immediate effect of the introduction of code, so far from making the law more certain, is to create a lengthy period of increased legal uncertainty. True, many hitherto doubtful issues will be settled, but the reformulation of the old rules and the adoption of new rules add to the systematization of the law are bound to open up new dispute. For each head of controversy that has been cut off, there will arise hydrolite, one or more new ones. And it will only be decades later, after court has become overlain with a thick incrustation of case law, that the old measures of legal certainty will be restored. When in 1854 Lord Cranworth submitted to the English judges a draft bill to codify the criminal law, Mr. Justice Dartford, after stating that to reduce the statute law into a narrow compass is an object entirely free from objection, and which, if accomplished with care, can produce nothing but good. But to reduce unwritten law to statute is to discard one of the greatest blessings we have for ages enjoyed in rules capable of a flexible adaptation. So, do you see if there is strength about flexibility within the common law tradition? And he said, I do not think any greater certainty can be obtained by code of the unwritten law to compensate for the loss. But on the contrary, new questions of construction of the laws of the words of same statutes will arise. Unforeseen difficulties in construction would be suggested, and new decisions more unsatisfactory than those which expound and apply principles would become necessary. I beg your excuse. I found a bending machine to sell these strings. Let me have. One shot. Okay, thank you. And he furthers, it is customary to blame the shortcomings of legislation on the draftsman who failed to foresee problems which, looked at with hindsight, were obviously bound to rise. The fact, however, is that even the best draftsmanship cannot prevent future disputes on the interpretation of statutory provisions. No finite wisdom can provide for the infinite and unknown variety and a complexity of future cases. The impossibility of foreseeing the future and the imperfections of language ensure that there will always be debatable points in the application of statute law, the borderline cases, and it is naturally upon these points that litigants will fasten. So, it may not be serious to Korean minds and legal minds, but it is actually serious to the original states of various codes. Of course, that is because the code is a very classic, a prototype nature to return to the liberal and classical period. For example, as I've said, the United States Constitution and the Civil Code of France and Germany. If, as happens in the best regulated legal systems, a court of law makes a bad ruling, courts subsequently concerned with the same point will soon put the matter right by distinguishing or overruling the unfortunate precedent. No equally easy remedy offers itself if a code makes a bad law. So the context is more serious in a coder tradition. Unless the words of the code are sufficiently elastic to permit the codes to stretch or bend their meaning, the cumbersome machinery of amending legislation has to be brought into action. Then, how do you perceive the restatement, I like to recall, to marshal the scope of rules, various rules, in the framework of a civil provisions? So it is in the context of interplay, and we also connote some taste of intelligent tradition. For example, you can see the philosophical attitude about the affairs we need to deliberate when resorting back to a Cartesian tradition in European continent. How about the experimentalism in Great Britain? So first, we have to engage in practical context of cases and controversies actually posed at the legal bar, and later we can have enforce some of principles and guidelines, basic rules to enlighten the betters in principled way. By contrast, we have some fundamental rules inherently from the humanity or kind. Do you see any points about creation circle of intelligence? In contrast to Darwinism, have you been exposed to the kind of controversy between fundamental camps of intelligence in the Western terms? Then how long this process can continue before the need for wholesale code revision arises depends upon the tempo of social and economic change and the readiness of the legislature and the profession to undertake the enormous task of redrafting the code. And last episode, this is an unduly a pessimistic assessment of the situation. It is only necessary to refer to the experience with Napoleon, the German Bulgaric Guestbook, and the Netherlands Wetbook. All three, to use words employed by Carter in relation to the Napoleon Code, have become buried under a heap of subsequent enactment and of judicial law. All three stand in need of wholesale revision. It is of the nature of law that the bulk of it should be certain, but that there always be a fuzzy zone of uncertainty around the edges. It is also of the nature of law that it stands perpetually in need of revision, if it is to remain in keeping with changing conditions. To think the law could be rendered either more certain or more stable by codification is to blame a certain form of law for attributes which are in fact inherent in the nature of law, whatever form it may take. Now we turn to see custom as a primary source of law in the civil law tradition. In the civil law theory of sources of law, custom is regularly listed as primary source, but routinely dismissed as of slight practical importance, except in Spain and some of other Spanish-speaking countries. In certain provinces of Spain, notably Catalonia, the national civil code does not apply to matters covered by local customary laws. In such places, custom is an important as well as a primary source of law. In other civil law countries, where custom is less important but still considered to have binding force, there is an apparent difference between systems such as the West German, which permit custom in certain cases to prevail over written law, and those systems which, like the French, permit custom to supplement, but not to abrogate the written law. So it is secondary source, as you see in the civil code discourse, civil law discourse. So it cannot contravene the written provisions, but absent any applicable written provisions, the custom could offer the standard that the jurist abide by. The real extent of this difference may be questioned, though in view of the rigorous insistence of the formal system on the establishment of true custom, and the relaxed attitude of the latter concerning the nicety of distinction between supplementation and abrogation. As might be expected, a custom plays a great role in commercial and labor law than it does in civil law generally. Some treatise writers have characterized settled case law as custom, but it's not officially recognized as such. What are general principles? It is sometimes said that general principles derived either from norms of a positive law or from the existence of legal order itself are a primary source of law. They are so characterized by some French writers, especially in connection with discussions of French administrative law, but also in discussions of judicial doctrine of abuse of rights and the expansion of notion of unjust enrichment. Such a characterization raises question whether the source of law is really the general principle or the judge, a problem which lies in connection with a interpretation. The following, I like to lead you to a treatise on comparative law, which contains a forceful exposition of the view that general principles are an important source of law. So we now on the verge of discussion concerning major legal systems. Before that, I like to present some picture to show the students who indulged in her study. And the picture portrayed above is jori in Korean. What is jori? I might get it compatible with the idea of law. Jori, raison, reason, and actually it is a tool for sifting and knowing. What is sifting and knowing? We can derive the rules or other points of reasonableness to use this tool, by using this tool. And you also be instructed that jori is one of bottom line and basic points of our reference to construct the rules and duty of jurists. They have to create, since they could not avoid the case, they have to adjudicate. There are no provisions or other references prescribed by literature. They may have no general principles in some cases. Then how could we rely on a source of law? jury. So, the fact that the cooperation of jurists is called for in the formulation of the law, and not only in its application, as in the use made of certain supereminent principles. These are found sometimes in the enacted law, and also, if need be, outside it. The recourse to these principles and the use made of them are difficult for theorists of legislative positivism to explain. They bring to light the fact that in the Romano-Germanic family, there is a subordination of law to the commands of justice, such as it is conceived at a given moment in a given period, and that this legal family is a jurist law, and not merely a system of legislative norms. Mention has already been made of the ways in which the legislators may sometimes renounce their function and expressly appeal to the cooperation of jurists in order to find the right solution to problem among many possible alternatives. The limitations of enacting law are obvious when the legislators come for power to judge inequity and refer to uses or even to natural law, or permit the application of statutory provisions to be set aside or modified in the interest of public order or good morals. No legislative system can do without such correctives or loopholes. In their absence, there would be the impermissible risk of creating a divorce between law and justice. The adage, summum jus summa injuria, in Latin word, is not the ideal of the Romano-Germanic laws, nor is it acquiesced in by them. Some injustice, in particular cases, may be the necessary price for just social order. The jurists of this family are not prepared to accept the juridical solution, which socially would be unjust. It is characteristic of the flexibility of the legal ideas in the Romano or Germanic family that equity has at all times been part of the law, and that no necessity of correcting the series of legal solutions by means of autonomous rules or codes of equity has ever been experienced. Legislative positivism and attacks on natural law lose most of their weight when one considers the extensive use made in periods of suitable legislation or crisis of the general formulae found in constitutions or enacted laws. The decline of this doctrine in contemporary world becomes apparent when the legislators themselves expressly and by their own authority ordain such new precepts as Article 2 of Swiss Civil Code, which prohibits the abuse of rights. So this article also influences the Korean Civil Code. So one commentator suggests we follow this Swiss Civil Code other than a German, that of Germany. Do you agree? So we need to undertake comparative work to see the nature of a category in terms of our civil history. Article 2A1 of the Greek Civil Code similarly provides that the exercise of right is prohibited if it manifestly exceeds the limits imposed by good faith or good morals or by the social or economic purpose of their right. Then, how about a supereminent principles? Jurists may put in peril if not provided for by legislation. But there are also a history to prosecute the judiciary in France, as I like to recall. So, general principle usually can be approached in a notorious context to expose that in the action, and in some cases, even the general principles may be waived to get the jurists to be exegetical, indulged in interpretive work. And actually, we may not be sure if the idea of law may be utilized by jurists in terms of continental traditions. But Rune David's suggestion would include the kind of dynamics idea. So on the basics, we may have some points of convergence between, although the ways of approach may be shown in a different fashion. In cases where the supereminent principles are provided for by law, it may be said the jurists act in virtue of a kind of delegation of powers from the legislators. But even when such powers have not been expressly conferred, jurists have nevertheless considered themselves to be so empowered by reason of the very function they are called upon to exercise. This power has been sparingly used because it is so that the best way to bring about justice in our society is to conform to the order established by the legal rules themselves. Nevertheless, there has been no hesitation about making use of it on occasion. French law particularly illustrates this attitude, whether in private law, for example, in the theory of the abuse of rights, or in public law, with appeal to the principe general du droit administratif. The theory of the abuse of rights might originally have been developed from that useful tool, Article 1382 of the Civil Code. It has now become clear, however, thanks to the Swiss example in particular, that this principle is not one of responsibility. It involves a general principle dominating the whole law, which, if legislators intend to formulate it, must come at the beginning of the code, the general section of the whole national law. Similarly, the development of the general principles of administrative law since the Second World War has pointed out the insufficiency of the legislative order and shown with renewed clarity the distinction in France between law and enacted law. Because of its history, France is probably the country where it was most natural for jurists to make their contribution to the evolution of law by reacting against the propositions of legislative positivism. Since they were the first to be attracted by these arguments, it was equally natural that they be the first to break away from them. It is interesting to know, however, that today the same tendency is being established in Germany, and as a healthy reaction to the doctrine which in the National Socialist era tended to sacrifice justice to politics and the racial mass. The value and sharpness of German reaction become particularly clear when it is considered it touches even the highest forms of legislation. The Supreme Court and even the Court of Constitutional Justice of German Federal Republic have not hesitated to confirm this in a series of judgments. Constitutional law is not limited to fundamental legislative texts, but is also made of certain general principles which the legislators have now rendered in the form of positive laws. So this point also concerns the intellectual framework about the constitutional law. Constitutional law is of public nature that usually regulates the relationship between the state and its people, subject, in terms of the public livings. So the election eligibility or the liberty interest in constitutional terms could be argued based on the constitutional document. But there is a growing tendency that we have expanded view of this interaction. So the Constitution and its provisions may have played a role to intervene into a private matters. So in that view, it is the point of a collective consensus of the nation to allow the scope of a moral agreement, a bit fundamental between the parties. So it may work into the private sphere. Do you agree? How much we always turn between about the dichotomy between the private and public sectors? So there is moreover a superpositive law which binds even the constituent legislators. The adoption of the idea according to which the constituent power could provide for everything at will would indicate a return to an outmoded positivism. One can imagine extreme circumstances in which the idea of law itself should prevail over a positive constitutional law. The Federal Court of Constitutional Justice might then be led to appraise such unconstitutionality. So we can see some intellectual hierarchy. The idea of law may preempt any normal arrangement found in constitutional document also. This concept was also employed to address the many issues. Particularly, you can see the constitutional review about a special act dealing with a former president Chen and Tae-ro, and the constitutional jurists in Korea employ the logic, which is fundamental beyond the explicit language of Constitution. So prescription may be preempted in some cases. For example, prevention of ex post law. It is a plain language that we can find in the Constitution. So the plain language rule dictates the jurist to use the provision to dispose the case. But it is serious and attracting a heavy extent of a public attention about the case. So the jurists shrewdly invented a fundamental ideas transcending the provision of Constitution, the idea of law, and it is fundamental even to retrovert all the language in the Constitution. Ex post law may not be applicable in some extremes of a circumstances. So the special act was not rendered unconstitutional if, although it directly contradicts the provision of Constitution. The ground for that decision would come with the underlying fundaments of idea of law. Norwegian legal doctrine admits for its part the idea of emergency constitutional law, which serves to legitimize irregular constitutional acts, which are, however, concerned with the fundamental principles and values of the Norwegian Constitution. In other countries, too, jurists have not hesitated on occasion to apply principles of moral nature. principles such as a pro omnia quorum and nemo contra factum prium penae potas. In Latin words. So actually pose a challenge to pronounce, which have not been expressed in legislation. In Spain, furthermore, recourse to such principles as legal basis. Article 6 of Spain Civil Code enumerates among the possible sources of law the general principles deduced from the Spanish codes and legislation. Finally, the theory of sources of law in all countries of the Romano-Germanic family seems both destined to realize and capable of fulfilling the traditional concept to which the reign of law in these countries lays claim. The law cannot be laid down a priori, nor can it reside exclusively in legal rules. The quest for law is a task to be accomplished by all jurists in common, each acting in a given sphere and using his own techniques, but always inspired by a common ideal, that of arriving, in each instance, at the solution which best conforms to the general sense of justice. A justice founded on a reconciliation of all kinds of interests of private individuals and the community. And we now see the sphere of authorities, which is not binding in legal technicalities, but having a much power of influence to be applicable to the case. So this is one point we distinguish from civil law traditions, the common law one. Let's see, a case law is generally considered mere authority, not a binding law. And also, I like to remind that the case law of other common law countries are authorities for other companions. And the case law of each respective nation is a binding law, where the state decisis rule should operate. But there are practical variations when in depth look into the dynamics of a state decisis rule. So that point also concerns the topic, convergence and divergence. We can see some of reform decision, even the state decisis are required. On all exhaustions of a distinguishing and integrating or comparing of various cases, the jurist may have occasion to see no possessive a case law to be applicable, and at the context of a precedence, which he can refer to resolve the case he handles. Then the case law may be created to guide the following cases that the later court should refer to. So we could be less definite although you are seriously exposed to the dichotomy between authorities and primary sources. So, from the preceding discussion of interpretation in civil law system, it is evident that case law plays an enormous role in the everyday operation of the legal system. Because of the necessity to interpret and apply the so-called written law, the civil law systems are in real sense case law systems. An important area of convergence with common law systems emerges here when we consider the extent to which the law of England and the United States become a statutory. Nevertheless, like the common law, the civil law tradition from ancient times has regarded the judicial function as limited to deciding particular cases. So now it seems like a usual practices. The Korean jurists have a first point of reference to the case laws. If you assault by your client to let her know the cases or for a favorable resolution court proceedings, then the attorney would firstly consider some similarities or points of distinction with other cases, precedents. Then we may see some convergence, actually. The notion goes back to Justinian that only the sovereign can make a generally applicable law. In modern nation states, the judge's role remains the same, but the limitation on his power was justified on ground that only a representative lesser church to be able to make law. We have seen in the foregoing section that the extent to which modern civil law systems have retreated from the principle. As it became generally recognized that judges frequently do in fact make law, the question arose whether and to what extent judicial decisions were source of law. Civil law theory does not recognize the existence of a formal doctrine of stare decisis. Thus, judicial pronouncements are not binding on lower courts in subsequent cases, nor are they binding on the same or coordinate courts. In the extreme French situation, as you have seen previously, the decision of the higher civil court is not even binding on a lower court in the same case until the second remand, and then only by statute. This former civil law theory of the law of case law is, however, subject to a number of qualifications. Initially, it is not a simple matter for High Court to decide a particular case one way and later to decide a similar case another way. If a division of the High Court wishes to deviate from a prior decision, the legal question involved will usually have to refer to a super panel of the court. This procedure has the obvious aim of assuring consistency in the output of the court charged with the ultimate responsibility for the uniformity of the application of the law within its own hierarchy. This context also incorporated into a Korean civil procedure. You can see provisions pertinent to have to create a forum of entire body of Supreme Court to overrule the precedents or prior laws. Second, in civil service judicial system, the de facto influence of high court decisions upon lower court judges is considerable. Third, the decision of the constitutional courts of West Germany and Italy on the compatibility of statute where the Constitution have the force of law. Fourth, a settled line of cases has great authority everywhere. In some parts of the Spanish-speaking world, The settled case law is made binding by legislation. Some German legal theorists consider that in rare instances, a line of cases can create a rule of customary law which is then binding as such. Fifth, it is observable that entire bodies of law in civil law systems have been built up by judicial decisions in a manner closely resembling the growth of Anglo-American common law. This is notable so, for example, in the case of French tort law, and also in French substantive administrative law, which is large and codified. So, you are led to scope of exceptional situations that the civil law orthodoxy may vary across the issues, the occasions involving respective jurisdictions. French, Germany, and Spain have partially a reformed practice about the role of case law, which is compared to the traditional holdings of principle. As a practical matter, it is generally recognized in civil law systems that judges do and should take heed of a prior decisions, especially when the settled case law shows that a line of cases has developed. Where the case law has not become settled, prior decisions of high courts have some weight. Even in France, where the force of precedent is weaker than in West Germany, the decisions of Council of State are considered reliable precedent, and some writers say that a single decision of Court of Cassation is important in settling the case law. Court decisions then are a de facto legal rules whose authority varies according to the number of similar decisions. The importance of the court issuing them and the weight to the opinion writer express himself or self. The extent to which a court has relied on prior decisions, however, is not always easy to determine in a given case. In this respect, judicial opinions in German-speaking countries bear a certain resemblance to American decisions with the presentation of facts, reasoning, and authorities. But the cryptic opinions of French Court of Cassation summarize the facts only briefly and do not refer to prior cases. Lower court opinions in France sometimes do cite cases and provide a more ample fact statements, but they are less informative than a typical West German or American opinion. When the courts are not forthcoming about the reasoning processes and the sources they have relied on, it is only by reading a line of cases that one can make inferences about the influence of a precedent. Civil law decisions weight for the same reason that underlie the common law doctrine of stare decisis. The most important of these reasons go to the very heart of the legal system, the requirements of reasonable certainty and predictability. The elementary demand of fairness that alike cases be treated alike, and the related but distinct consideration that justice should not only be done, but should appear to have been done. In addition to serving the values of predictability, fairness, and legitimacy, continuity in the case law is itself in no small way promoted by such homely considerations as the conservation of mental energy and the fear of reversal. In view of the importance of case law as a civil law authority, the sometimes asserted contrast between civil and common law systems in this area appears as more of a nuance than a major difference. This seems especially so when it is recalled that in the United States, stare decisis, as a formal rule, only means that the decision of higher court is binding on lower courts in the same jurisdiction in cases on all fours with each other. In all other situations, state decisis in American common law is, as in the civil law, not a rule, but merely an observable aspect of judicial behavior. So it is a point of delicacy and subtlety to expose us to be complicated about actual consequence that the rule of state decisis brought of the cases. In England, however, where a more rigid view of precedent prevails, it was only in 1966 that the House of Lords announced that it considered itself free to depart from its own prior decisions. Thus, one may say the contrast in the weight accorded to case law is greatest between England and France, and least between the United States and West Germany. So you can see the role of these stances to have here more facilitated a viewpoint about extent of a state decisis and role of case laws. So, and we now turn to see a doctrine as an authority. The writings of legal scholars, like the decisions of courts, are considered authorities in civil law system. The role of doctrine is, however, quite different from that of the case law. As you have just seen, case law authority operates to settle the law and to assure a degree of internal coherence and consistency within a judicial hierarchy. The learned writing or doctrine, on the other hand, exerts its greatest direct influence when the law is unsettled or when there is no established law on a point. But the two types of authorities are related. In the civil law systems, have left the task of organizing and analyzing the case law mainly to the learned writers. Thus, the doctrine indirectly controls, to a great extent, the judge's understanding of the case law. The weight attached by judges to doctrinal writing varies according to a number of circumstances, including the reputation of the author and whether the view expressed is an isolated one or represents the consensus of the most respected writers. In general, it can be said that civil law judges pay close attention to scholarly opinions as expressed in general and specialized treatises, commentaries on the cause, monographs, law review articles, and case notes, and expert opinions rendered in connection with litigation. Persistent doctrinal criticism will often prompt re-examination of holding and will sometimes even lead to the amendment of an established judicial position. As we noted earlier in our discussion of the role of legal scholars in civil law systems, the importance of the academic's function in presenting analysis of cases and statutes of judges and lawyers is hard to overestimate. There is a circular chain of reinforcement among the civil law theory on the force of case law, the mechanics of law finding, and the influence of legal writers. Since case law is not binding, civil law systems lack sophisticated and comprehensive citators for direct access to cases and for the coordination of cases with each other and with statutes. The absence of such tools, in turn, would make it very difficult for a formal system of state decisis to operate. As things stand, periodicals and treatises which collect and analyze the most important cases become the main sources relied upon in research. But this means the one set of authorities is selected and filtered by another. It will be extremely interesting to observe the effect on civil law practice and education of the introduction of computerized law-finding devices of the type that are common in the United States. So I suppose you certainly have a chance to visit the website of Westlaw And you can see the cases and scholarly articles which have a citations in the efforts to provide a reference for the delivery. And the court judges strongly tend to cite these writings of law professor, and that is not the case for Korean jurists. So it is a point of delicacy. You can see some contrast surrounding the law of doctrine in terms of legal sources. Once again, however, the apparent differences between the civil and common law system should not be exaggerated. In the latter, certain kinds of legal writing and certain writers have become highly influential, as evidenced by the measurable increase in citations to law review articles in contemporary judicial opinions. As I have said, the civil law jurists usually play the role in exegetical interaction with the statute. So interpret task is principle, and in some cases we find a shortened context of a court dealings, including a gist of a holdings and some methods of a reasoning and applied provisions, applicable provisions, and the provisions which is actually applied to the case. And in other cases, even the brief of reasoning may be waived to show a simplistic form, including the opinion and the provisions which are to be applied to the case. Typically tended on a French system, later will be briefed. So the style and fashion of adjudication also involves kind of nuanced context between the two traditions. So manner of style and legal education and the kind of intelligent tradition all combine to help the competitors to understand the traditions of law. So now I'd like to let you have some ideas about interpretation exercised in practices to much extent by a civil law jurist. One of the many ways in which the classic codification represented a break with the civil law past was in the transformation of the idea of sources of law. The jus commune and previous authorities of all sorts were displaced by codes that were supposed to be comprehensive within the areas they covered. In the post-codification era, scholarly attention and the judicial process has focused on codes, their language, their structure, the interpretation of the parts, and the animating spirit. An enormous volume of literature on the interpretation has been generated. Indeed, one may say that the techniques of interpretation of enacted law has become as much of the art in civil law systems as the manner of dealing with case law has in common law systems. Since it is in connection with the civil codes that these techniques have been refined, The distinction here will be concerned primarily with code interpretation. But it must be remembered that in modern civil law systems, a judge's everyday work is as much a concern with ordinary statute, decrees, and regulations as it is with the language of codes, and the theory and techniques of interpretation may be modified depending on the source of the legal norm involved. Since time of codification, there has been considerable evolution in the way of the relation of the judicial process to the written law has been perceived. The evolution, which has taken somewhat different courses in different countries. We may begin our consideration of this by distinguishing four different types of intellectual operations that are often grouped together in the general heading of interpretation. First, there is the kind of interpretation involved in every use of language. So I picked up 4 points of essence to every grasp this of interpretation, the aspect of interpretation, every use of language, which is most basic and must be respected by a jurist if he or she works in the civil law tradition. A plain language rule also pertains to the counterparts, and so fundamentally, a democratic principle of governance dominates the discourse to assign the task of second nature. The jurists of both tradition should not contravene the wills of people collectively in the political representation. So, plain language rule may echo in that context, and also it is one of essential rules the common law judges must abide by. Typically, the civil law jurists would go more deeply on this rule, and ambiguities and non-clarity, which poses a second phase of interpretive issue. The jurist may face with ambiguous language, less clear command from the legislature. And in war situation, they may see gap of less of text. And finally, we can see a complete silence, no context of a mandate from the legislature. I like to show the picture portraying a National Assembly of Korea. They work and research to give a more refined statute of provisions to the jurists. Then, but how come with this scope? So first, there is the kind of interpretation involved in every use of language. The statement of the linguistically most plausible meaning to be ascribed to the words used. If one meaning is much more plausible than others, and it covers the case before the court, the judge applies the position. This process of ascertaining meaning may be so automatic and unconscious that the judge may think of it as law finding, although modern linguistic theory would describe it as interpretation. The dream of the draftsman of Peruvian civil code, the oral could be so found and applied, has long since proved to be an illusion. But the fact remains that many everyday legal questions can be and are resolved in just this way. A second type of interpretation occurs when there is an ambiguous or unclear provision or an apparent inconsistency between provisions in text. A third type occurs when there is a gap in a lesser text. In these second and third situations, the process of interpretation becomes a conscious one. Here, all civil law systems are characterized by the presence of a number of methods devised to elucidate unclear or ambiguous text and to help supply lacunae in a legal law. All of these methods have in common the ultimate aim of applying the legal rules as clarified or completed. Fourth, an entire different set of intellectual operations is involved when the usual gap filling or ambiguity resolving methods fail to yield solution, when the law is completely silent on a problem, or when an old law, because of a change in circumstances, has become completely unsuitable to current conditions. Though the judge's activity in these situations is often disguised or characterized as interpretation, it is clear that whatever process he or she engages in is not a interpretation in the sense of search for the meaning of a legislative text. In this fourth group of situations, judges develop the law on their own, but there is great variation in the extent to which this is openly acknowledged and in the manner in which the judges proceed in modern civil law systems. In France, for reasons which are largely historical, the process of judicial development is largely hidden from view, in contrast to what the Western German scholar Lawrence has called the open development of the law in Germany. So, I must seek your excuse for a delay of this class, and also more seriously to replicate the practices of the class. Okay, I am satisfied with progress, and I exhaust all preparations for this class, but except the time agreement. So it will be a little lengthier, exceeding the 50 minutes as engaged in class, but I hope this lecture will help you on your further study. And in next class, we have some other aspects of discussion involving a judicial interpretation of written rules. The article includes a set of guidelines which leads the civil law jurists to adhere with on their interpretive work. For example, the principle, derogations, methods of interpretation, and the formula, and also the purpose of law rule would be touched on to for guidance of interpretation. So I now stop here. There will be all for this class, and I expect to meet in next class.